Directly dive into our keynote. So our keynote speaker today is a designer, entrepreneur, and a technologist with a slant towards architecture, the future, creative independence, and a world driven more globally by people. He founded Lost Arts, Subsistence, and most notably co-founded Kickstarter in 2009, which since its inception has raised over $22 billion from over 6.4 million people for over 75,000 successful projects, ranging from computer games to music albums, technology, fashion, educational projects, and full-length feature films. Named as one of the Forbes magazine top 12 most disruptive figures in business, please welcome Charles Adler.
Hello. Hello. Oh, good. I like that. How's everyone doing today? Great. I heard I'm in the town of Ron Burgundy, so I feel like I should have had a better intro. Like that like there's something, I should have mustache or something. Cool. So if we can pull that up, cool. Thank you. I want to explain myself for half a minute, and then we'll get into the presentation. What I mean by that is, the word disruption and technology and startup and designer and technologist. One of the things that I find very difficult about myself is all of those things are true, and I am not good at any one of those things. So I'm what you call a generalist. Anybody familiar with the term or can relate to that? Cool. And so this is not a talk purely about technology. This is not a talk purely about design. Or even, frankly, purely about Kickstarter. I'm not going to go deep into that, but maybe more broadly about where we're going with society, this weird, kind of awkward, almost frustrating moment that we're in, but also, I would argue, exciting moment that we're in. So I'm going to take like a really broad sweep in terms of where we are. All right. So I will also say that I'm an optimist, so I will apologize about that. I think we're in a moment where people like me are shunned sometimes. It's a joke. Yeah. So I tend to be fairly optimistic in this in the realm of this talk. The optimism that I have personally, as I would argue, a creative person and somebody who is frankly just fascinated with the experience that a creative person has to go through, an artist, a technologist, an architect, a designer, even a business person or an entrepreneur. Anytime that you're creating something new, there is a tumultuous kind of experience the next day, right? The sort of the string of moments to try and bring that thing to life and to existence. But it's this moment where we are, I would argue, celebrating the creative, celebrating creativity. It tends to kind of focus into the technology world, what 12-year-old kid just launched the thing that's going to take down Facebook kind of story. But again, kind of going back to that introduction, this moment that we're in now, to me, is well beyond technology, right? So this is the first time I've been to San Diego, but anybody grew up here? Literally one, two people. Okay, cool. So it's clearly a city of transients. Anybody been here longer than 10 years? Okay, cool. So would it be safe to say that the city has changed dramatically over the last 10 years, right? That's literally happening everywhere, right? And I think that's some part due to technology, arguably the only technology that matters in this case, which is the internet. But I think it's far broader than just the apps that we build or whatever technology or pipes that we're running. All right, so if we can keep these slides up, that would be cool. Thanks. So, the reason for this image is because the question here, in some capacity, and I think this is the root of any creative moment, is what does it look like? So my question with this slide is, what is this? Is this an art project? Is it a technology project? Is it an IoT technology that's going to change the future of reality? Anybody want to take a guess? Nobody's daring enough to take a guess? All of it, yeah. And I would argue that Justin, the guy who is working on this, doesn't even know the answer to that either, right? And so that's an expression of what I mean by this creative moment. This moment where we have all of these tools at our disposal, whether it's like a hammer or a table saw or the internet, right? Or a computer, or a phone, or what have you, a soldering iron. We have all of these tools at our disposal, and it leaves this amazing potpourri of creativity kind of flourishing out into the world. So because I've got an ego, meaning a microphone, and the clicker thing, I'm going to take you down a little bit of an egotistical story, but this is kind of a lead-in into Kickstarter. What I'm giving you is the backstory, my own personal backstory, where I came from, what informed the world that I've grown up in, and by virtue of that, where Kickstarter came from, right? So I grew up on the East Coast in Connecticut, a little hobbitville called Westport, Connecticut. Anybody watch Martha Stewart before she went to prison? Yeah? So the Turkey Hill House, I used to run by the Turkey Hill House all the time. That's a whole nother presentation. But growing up in Connecticut, I was also in the shadow of New York, and I was fascinated by virtue of having access to this incredible city with another incredible moment, which was the late 70s, early 80s, where there was this other era of massive, kind of what I would argue is global creativity. Hip-hop, punk rock, graffiti, which back then was illegal. Now we're paying artists to put murals up. We just renamed it, right? And these little weird things called computers that also looked like professional things and also looked like little Ataris that you played games on. And all of these things fascinated me. I would argue that as a kid in Westport, Connecticut, I was not the most popular kid. There were 2 years where I wasn't even in the yearbook. Cool. And what that story is effectively meant to say is that for whatever reason, I don't know what the root cause of this was, but I've always been fascinated and attracted to the fringes of mainstream culture. All of those examples that I gave, right? And I'll focus a little bit on this sort of punk rock narrative, but I would argue that the same kind of ethos equates to every other sort of sub-genre or discipline within the arts or technology or creativity. And that was this mantra that the rules are meant to be broken, right? You can, like most expressively see this, I would argue, in hip-hop and in punk rock, right? Which was there's this anti-establishment narrative, right? Literally breaking walls down, right? This is the Berlin Wall, if anybody knows their history. And what was interesting about this, it was like, what were we fighting against, right? Now, the first question should be, what were we fighting for? And I would argue the thing that we were fighting for collectively was arguably the most basic thing, particularly in this country, which is self-expression, right? I have something to say. There is no outlet for me to say it in. So if you want to pick on the music industry for a little while, a major record label is not going to pick up a little punk rock band in Danbury, Connecticut, or the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1978, right? Now project back up to 1992, and there's this other kind of era of Nirvana and Seattle, and they made it. But in those early days, nobody's really going to listen to them. So they need to do what? DIY. They need to kind of take the world into their own hands. And that's a lot of what this mantra was pushing towards. And the thing that we're fighting against, I would argue, which is interesting in this sort of juxtaposition between what I would say is operational excellence. We'll talk a little bit about that. I think you guys were kind of discussing a little bit of that before I came up here. There's this tension between operational excellence and actual creativity, which is arguably very messy, right? And almost to the point of that first slide, you don't even know what direction it's going to take you in. And so I would argue that a lot of what we were fighting against was this industrialization of, quite frankly, everything, even the arts. But it also got into the places that we worked, right? So factory floors. Anybody remember Laverne and Shirley? Nobody? A couple people? Okay, good. All right, I'm like dating myself here. So Laverne and Shirley, like if you see the opening and closing credits, it's kind of this joke, the farce around this industrialized world that they were working in. Put the glove on the bottle, the beer bottle, I think is what they were doing, right? And so, like a very inhumane place to work. Something that was actually designed probably more so for robots. Like, that looks kind of awful. All right. So this was me in the late 90s and early 2000s. And what I mean by that is I worked at an agency. Anybody work for an agency in here? I'm assuming probably not, right? Good. Okay, it's safe. So I worked in an agency, working for major clients around the world as a designer and a technologist. So I wrote code and pushed pixels in Photoshop. And what I realized over time was that little punk rock kid, it kind of like started losing some of that vitality. And I thought that the work that I was doing was for a valuable purpose. But the reality was I just felt like one of these silly little kittens with the headphones on. Thank you, Tumblr. Anybody remember Tumblr? Yeah, cool. Okay, good. Hashtag Tumblr. I just felt like a little pawn in the mix of this larger organization. So I eventually ended up quitting. But that's enough about me. I want to kind of back up into what I would argue is like the results of all of this industrialization into creative disciplines and arguably industrializing many things that were not, that were innocent and pure at one point in time. The results generally turn out pretty weak. And what I mean by results, I mean cultural results, right? And at some point, I would also argue economic results. So let's pick on an industry that is pretty close to here, but let's hope that nobody in the audience is my guinea pig. Anybody in the film industry? Nobody? Cool. Also safe. So I'm going to pick on LA for a little bit, or Hollywood most specifically. Anybody remember a kind of a badass film from the 90s with this guy named Bruce Willis? Die Hard? Yep, good. So Die Hard. How many Die Hards were we fed? 15, 20, 30? I don't know. A lot of them, right? Like lost count, right? Lost the point. This is kind of my point, right? So at some point in time, I could imagine an executive taking a risk on this guy, Bruce Willis. Like, what did he do before Die Hard? I actually don't remember. Moonlighting? Was that a thing? I don't know. History is hard for me. But so Die Hard, somebody took a risk on the very first one, and it killed it. It did incredibly well. And so what did they do? Right? They do it again and again and again until we're what? Bored, right? Another film series. Let's project out a decade. So later, we all had some. I think somebody was guessing it. Were you guessing it? There, yeah. No, but that's also fair. Close. We'll get there. Just patience. Slow. So what was interesting, if the Mission Impossible, I don't know when Mission Impossible came about, maybe in the middle, so maybe there's a little lesson for me in here, but if you play with my story, a decade out, we all culturally had some time to kind of breathe. We got fed the same thing over again. So anybody want to take a guess? Not Bruce Willis this time, this guy named Matt Damon. Born Identity. So you're kind of right with Mission Impossible. Maybe the time period is shorter between these gaps, but effectively, what did they do again? They took a risk. It did incredibly well, and we got fed over and over and over again. Now, arguably, I think both films are awesome and entertaining. It's no dig on those storylines or those films or those actors. All cool. But what I'm trying to prove a point of is this other side to this. So millions of dollars are piped into the same thing over and over again. We're just getting fed Twinkies all over and over and over again. We live in a world of scarcity, at least for the time being. And I don't know. And in that world of scarcity, when you're delivering capital in one direction, it can't go in the other, right? And so there's this plethora of people in the world, creative people, that you might work with, or that may not even want to work with you, which is a whole other conversation. Where do they want to be? And they're left, those projects and those ideas are left on the cutting room floor. They don't actually get to us, right? And so I think there's a double side to this, which is they actually don't get to live the life that they want to live, their personal creative self-expression. But then we also don't get as colorful a world. We don't get new ideas pumped into our brain, right? We're kind of getting fed the same thing over and over again. So this is this little bit of an egotistical trip, or a backstory, if you will, that was the premise that was shared amongst the three of us. So there's three of us who started Kickstarter together, launched on April 28th of 2009. And it was that kind of backstory that we shared. We didn't grow up together. We didn't know each other. We met each other because of Kickstarter. But it was that shared life experience that parlayed into what we built. And so the intention behind what we built with Kickstarter, any people back campaigns in here? Anybody back? Cool, cool. Like it. Thank you. So for those of you who raise your hands, you understand how the mechanism works. We can talk about how the mechanism for Kickstarter works later. But at the end of the day, an independent person with an independent idea puts it out to the internet, promotes the project themselves, and it's up to the audience, sort of public at large, to make the decision, right? The crowd, as we call it, not the lone executive sitting in an ivory tower. You can get where my narrative might go. All right, so that all sounds well and good. A lot of big numbers were kind of projected earlier. But I think there's another part of this story that I think is really important, which is we were in what I would describe as an invisible race. And so the plight of an entrepreneur or the plight of a creative person, doesn't matter what discipline you work in, there's always somebody working on the same thing or something proximate, right? And so we were in this invisible race, right? We had to launch. We saw competitors launching. And so part of this story is like there was no guarantee that the thing that we were working on was going to be the thing that got me to talk to you on stage, if that means anything. So what I want to carry you through now is some of those early days, what I would argue is the humble beginnings of any project turned company. Because I think those humble beginnings are often missed when we talk about these massive fundings or the massive growth of a lot of these companies, and they're really, really important. So I think the most humble place to start is literally the first campaign that ever got funded on Kickstarter. So I said we launched on April 28th of 2009. So call this May. I don't know, memory's a little foggy. It's about a little over a decade ago at this point. But Drawing for Dollars was the name of this project by somebody named Dark Pony. Number one, pseudonymity on the internet, super dope. I have no idea whether Dark Pony is a man, a woman, or something in between. All super awesome to me. But the story behind Dark Pony and the project was super interesting. It was about as innocent as the first project could be, both in the amount of money it wanted to raise and the project itself. So Drawing for Dollars, it's a pretty practical title. Anybody want to guess what Dark Pony was trying to do? Sell some artwork? Yep. The real story was that Dark Pony was frustrated by the fact that he or she couldn't finish a drawing and thought that capital and a customer would force their hand, right? So that was just kind of intellectually interesting to me. I was like, that's a cool use of this thing that we just launched. Dark Pony wanted to raise a total of $15. Crazy, right? And expected each drawing would cost $5. So that's a, total of how many people? 3 people, cool. So there was a little foreshadowing here, which I can only say now, couldn't say then. Dark Pony killed it, $35, right? $35 were funded on the platform. 3 people, you can do the math, somebody or all 3 people were generous. So there's another thing. One was the potential for someone to go over. You can always go over, you can't go under with Kickstarter. The other piece was generosity. And I think both of those things kind of carry forward into every single campaign on the platform. All right, so let's fast forward a couple more months. This project, or I should say Allison specifically, holds a special place in my heart, not only because it was very early in Kickstarter's history that Allison was experimenting, but because she is, I would argue, 2, if not more things. What I mean by that is Allison was by day a graphic design student in Athens, Georgia, and at night and on the weekends, she pulled out her guitar, pulled out whatever, this was pre-iPhone, so whatever you used to record yourself, and then shared it on YouTube and Tumblr. She came along in the spring or summer of 2009 and wanted to raise a ridiculous $2,000 for an album. Now, we moved from $35. We'd seen more raised by this point in time, still talking about 2009, only a couple of months. But by that point, we had only seen about $1,500 raised, right? I'd had friends who were starting record labels, and they're like, oh, it's going to cost me $1,500. And I'm like, I don't think you're going to be able to raise $1,500. Like, nobody knows you, right? This whole story. And so along came Allison. She wanted to raise $2,000, which was crazy for us. But it got crazier still. There's another kind of proof point moment for us. So she launched, I want to say, 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning in the summer of 2009. And By midnight that night, she had raised her $2,000, right? $1,500 was our previous maximum that took about 30 days to get to, right? So here, within a day, she raised $2,000. We didn't know who Allison was, right? This was one of the early folks that it spread, sort of the reach that Kickstarter had spread beyond our little network of friends. And so we started digging, like, WTF, who is Allison? Like, how did this happen? And where is this going, right? So one of the lessons that Allison taught us was that it's really important to have an audience. And we kind of knew that already, but the audience that she had, I'll go back to Tumblr, she had a very active audience on Tumblr, small but active. And so when she launched her campaign, she catalyzed that audience to move from Tumblr over to Kickstarter just for a moment. And that's where the $2,000 came from, right? What was really important in terms of invention, and I think this is for anyone who's responsible for technology development within your organization, I think it's really important to also observe and learn from the behaviors of how people use it. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're using it wrong. You might have built it wrong, right? That's the designer in me. And so with Allison, she ended up creating something. Anybody familiar with the term stretch goals? Has anyone? Okay, so that's Allison, literally. At least to my knowledge, maybe from a different industry, a different world, that was a thing. But for us, it was all Allison. And so she had created this little incentive program to get people to spread the word and back deeper into the campaign, which got her to amass over $7,000 raised on the platform from 200 people. Now, mind you, this is from a college student in Athens, Georgia, completely disconnected from, the landscape of New York music scene or San Francisco's tech scene, right? And I think there's something beautiful in there. I'll say one last thing about Allison, which is a story I don't tell too often. So she raised her money. She got the album in production and started to move the wheels on that project. And she decided to go on tour. Now, she wasn't signed to a major label, none of that yet. She went on tour. One of our advisors who lives in Portland, Oregon, texted me around 2 o'clock in the morning because #entrepreneur up at all hours, AKA me. And it was like, hey, Allison's in town. I'm going to go to the show. It's going to be super awesome. I was like, sweet, go tell me how it is. He comes back a couple hours later, #I'm still up. And he messages me. He's like, yeah, it was awesome to see her, but it was super depressing. And I was like, well, what does that mean? It's like, well, she was on the internet, and now she's in real life. Like, that's super cool. I got to have a beer with her and all that stuff. But there was, like, nobody there. In Portland, Oregon. Anybody been to Portland? Like, another music town, super awesome city, right? Nobody was there. So what did that teach me, again, is another kind of abstraction of what I would say is this dialogue between the real world and the internet. Is the internet is also a place, right? Her venue was the internet early on. The internet was her little dive bar in Athens, Georgia, but it was actually accessing a group of people around the world. And so I don't know where that goes, but it's just like a little seed out there. We can maybe discuss that later. I don't know, that'd be fun. All right, let's move on. So anybody know this project? Pebble? I think a lot of people should. Yeah, okay, cool. So I'm fast forwarding a lot. Now this is getting into the mega territory. Let's just cut to the chase. Anybody want to guess what this campaign raised? How many? $2 million. Multiply that by 10. Yeah. So this was also their second campaign, right? $20 million. Now the important part to this story, going back to LA and that poor executive that I'm going to keep picking on, is our world is filled with gatekeepers. You guys are all probably gatekeepers. I know I'm a gatekeeper from time to time, right? We're in a position and a job to say no to something. But we actually are only saying no because of the kind of myopic lens of our history, our experience, right? And that's quite unfortunate because it leaves, like I said earlier, a lot of really brilliant and potentially lucrative and world-changing ideas on the floor, right? And this was one of them for sure. So Eric Magowski, who's the founder of Pebble, Canadian entrepreneur and technologist, had worked in IoT stuff before, or encased electronics before, had a wealth of experience in this domain, so he wasn't a noob, right? First-time entrepreneur, going around Silicon Valley saying, yo, give me some money to build this connected watch. I'm going to beat Apple to the punch. What do you think the answer was? Nope. Who are you? Like, hardware's hard, right? That's the narrative. If anyone's in the hardware space, hardware is very hard. IoT is still very hard. It's sort of an awkward stage. And so in 2013, when they started with their first campaign, now this is their second. It was even harder back then, right? And so it's no doubt that they would get no's. They came to Kickstarter. The first campaign raised half as much as this, so $10 million out of the gate, right? And so to me, what that signifies is the gatekeepers are more often than not pretty wrong, right? We're all generally wrong at predicting the future, right? And so our thesis has always been, and I think it proves itself time and time again, is if you put it out to the masses, and if you can reach as many people as possible, at least your beta community, your early adopters, as we call them, right? You have a fighting chance to even gauge whether your idea is worth fighting for, right? Clearly this one was worth fighting for. They also raised a third campaign after this one, which raised $13 million, and then they sold the company a couple months later. And I think Eric's off doing another company at this point. So, at some level, what you can look at is everything's viable, from little $15 campaigns that raise $35. We've seen dollar campaigns, like $1, right? That's funny, exactly, right? To $20 million. Like that talks about the elasticity, I would argue, of platforms, right? But also proves a point around this incredible moment that we're in of creativity, from art to personal projects to technology projects. All right, so I want to get back to something that's a little bit more humble and maybe a little bit more personal, but also I think projects a future in a way that's a little bit different than I've talked about to date. So any parents in the audience? Okay, cool. I am also a parent. And some days that's good, sometimes that's bad. But thankfully, I'm in San Diego without them today. That's cool. Is this being recorded? Oh. Sorry, Phoebe. Sorry, Noah. All right, so this is a story of kids, 5 of them, ranging in age from middle school and high school. Can anybody guess what the Viper is? It's not a car. That's a joke. Remember that car? Okay. Anybody want to guess? What are they sitting in the background? Little Cessna. Yeah. So these middle school and high school kids want to turn that Cessna into a flight simulator. Like, what? I don't know. When I was their age, I was not thinking of building a flight simulator, right? I was thinking of like kick flips and ollies and other things. Definitely not a flight simulator. So with the help of parents and teachers, of course, right? Because legally we have to make sure that they're there, they started down the road of building this flight simulator. And arguably, they've raised more money than I've even ever raised on my own platform. So they raised just shy of $12,000 from 383 people. Yep, 383 people, many of which I bet don't even know who they were, right? And so the story behind this project, or I think the sort of ethos that I want to project behind this project, which is a projection into the future, right, is best summed up through the story of somebody who was backing the campaign. So again, hashtag entrepreneur, founder, all that good stuff. You're obsessive about the thing that you're making and building and evolving and trying to figure out all the ways that it's wrong, right? And so in this whole spectrum of time, you're obsessing over every project, every conversation in every project. And I happened to stumble across this comment by a mother that just struck me. And she was, for whatever reason, expressing why she had backed the campaign. Right? Often we don't see this, but it was somebody who felt emotional enough or driven enough to tell the audience of other folks that were backing the campaign why she backed. Story goes, she didn't know these kids, but her comment went something like this. Memory a little foggy, but bear with me. I don't know these kids, but I hope that someday somebody sees in my kids what I see in these 5 kids, right? And so to me, what that punched me in the gut and the heart with was the thing that we had built and the capital that runs through this engine to these creative people is tangibly valuable from the ability to make the things, but I think more intellectually and personally and emotionally more powerful because it is really more conduit for love, conduit for courage, for a acknowledgement that the ideas that you have, even if you're a little punk, maybe the kid in the middle scares me sometimes. If you watch the video, you understand why. He gets so intense. But, intense little kid, your ideas and your tenacious intent is valuable. And so the thing that projects into the future for me, what I get out of this project, I might have some bias here, but what I get out of this project is where do these kids get to go? 10, 15, 20 years. Like if they're building a flight simulator now, like WTF, what are they going to build later? And how is the world going to change because of them? And how is it going to change because of them? Because of the innocent contribution that people like that mother had made to help them along their journey to create this crazy flight simulator. I don't even know if they ever made it, but I hope they did. All right, so that was fun. The reality is, I want to kind of back out of Kickstarter a little bit. Like, we're not clearly alone. The world is changing in many heroic ways, amazing ways, sometimes terrible ways, I'll admit that. But this spectrum of technologies, and this is just a quick little scan of things that are off the top of my head, that are reformatting society and reformatting the way that we live, right? And maybe that gets a little bit too much, talked about a little bit too much, but it's something I very deeply believe in, which is these avenues and this use of technology for self-expression, right, for our First Amendment right, so to speak, but for self-expression and to engage in the world in a very different way, right? We talk about this within the context of the future of work. We'll certainly talk about that later as well. But it's all of these technologies and the things that we're inventing every single day that excite me and give me hope and optimism for a future that I hope is putting each of us in more of a power position for ourselves and not for somebody else. Okay, so I did something in 2014 that my dad thought I was crazy to do, which was I left Kickstarter. He also thought I was crazy to start Kickstarter, so I don't know how to take my dad's advice. Not too often, I guess. So I'm working on a new thing, but I didn't know it back in 2013, 2014. I went on this sort of flaneurs jaunt around the world, still on that journey, discovering what is a problem in this day and age that creatives still have, right? So I am obsessed by what I would argue is the Sisyphusian story of creativity. Anybody know the story of Sisyphus? Again, thank you, Tumblr. I have no idea why somebody made this, but it's kind of dope, right? Yeah, thank you to whoever made this out of Legos. So this is literally the story of Sisyphus, but I guess you have to turn it up because Sisyphus pushes a rock up the hill for it to forever fall down. To me, that is the story of any person creating something new and trying to force it into the world, right? And I say it in that way because that is the story of an artist, that is the story of an entrepreneur, that's the story of a technologist. And so I'm interested in what is needed for them now, knowing I'm going to do the thing I'd never do and back up. Oh my God, is it going to work? With all of these things at our disposal, what's missing, right? Boop. Boop. Cool. So I started out with a project that was focused on the physical space. Like, it's weird going from the internet to like brick and mortar. So I built a little prototype space in Chicago. I live in Chicago now. That is called Lost Arts. It was focused on empowering creatives with tools, a potpourri of tools, and space, right? As cities become more dense, San Diego seems to be becoming more dense, right? I don't mean intellectually, I mean physically. As cities become more dense, they're going to get what? More expensive, right? They're going to get more expensive, and so space is going to be harder and harder to come by for creative work. Creative work meaning things that don't necessarily turn a profit right away. So where do we go and be creative? I was interested in this. I did a couple of experiments around this. You can see some of the examples of said thing. There's Justin working on that little thing that we were putting the question at the beginning. I still don't know what he's doing with that or if he's even doing it anymore. And that doesn't even matter, right? So there was a number of projects that came out of this, both software-wise and hardware. And when I mean hardware, I mean like physical things that are connected to the internet, like this art project in the upper right-hand corner, which is putting you into a trance, to hardware things that are inert, like Ted and Sharon down here, who are creating a cast iron oven that goes into an oven. You'd have to get me drunk to tell you later what that's all about, but it's not as meta as it sounds. And so a number of things came out. It's a really interesting business model, could be a thing, but then I had this little moment of like, is there something that can impact the world in a much bigger way? And physical locations have a constraint to them. It's called the geographic footprint and price per square foot. Those things suck. Sorry, anybody in real estate? Yeah, I'm a bearer of bad news. So I did a pivot before the project actually ever fully got off the ground, right? So I had it run in Chicago twice, did a pivot. Can't really talk about that now. We're in stealth mode, but it's pivoting into software. And my interest in software wasn't just because I've sort of been grown up in this world of computers and code and design, but more so in the value that it provides, which is usurping or getting over the constraints of geography, right? And giving people access to different tools. I'm talking in vagary right now, but the point is more this, which is you never know unless you try. There is no guaranteed success. If I talk about earlier that invisible race that we're in, I'm going to make a joke here again. Indiegogo could have been. Anybody know Indiegogo? Nah, nobody knows Indiegogo. No, you know Indiegogo? Okay, cool. Indiegogo is our main competitor. In second place, you can tell my bias is with Kickstarter, of course. But there was no guarantee that we were going to win, right? There was no guarantee that anybody would even use us, right? And the same goes for this new project, Lost Arts, but you never know unless you try. And I think forever, I mean, even the world that I grew up in, I don't know why I am the way that I am, but I'm generally pretty risk averse. The world that we grow up in is we want secure results. We want guaranteed results. You guys probably actually live that world day to day. And I'll say that world is honestly BS. There are no guaranteed results unless you're the most conservative thing on the planet. Like there is no guarantee in life. And so I tend to believe this, that the future is dictated by those who take some level of risk. It doesn't need to be heroism. You don't need to bet the farm on it. But take some level of risk to put your idea out there. Just be open with it, right? So I want to close on this one last thought. As I mentioned, I've got 2 kids, and those kids tend to what? Wear you down, right? Right? Yeah, okay, cool. I still love them. I love my kids. I love your kids. But they wear us down. I was also hitting my 40s when I left Kickstarter, and was also amid a number of conversations with folks that were in larger corporations and what I will call incumbent industries. And the conversation was something like this, like, how do we be more like a startup? And I was like, oh my God, midlife crisis. Like, you can't do that, right? That's like going out and buying a Ferrari and ... right? It doesn't work. It looks awkward, all of those things, right? 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 Right. Yes. Yes, yeah. But it got me thinking about how does that work, or how could that work in this day and age, right? In this day and age, and what I mean by this day and age is the world is changing faster than it's ever changed before, and it'll continue to get faster and faster, right? I was thinking this morning that we live in such a weird place where literally almost everything is disposable, unfortunately, for the environment and us and our kids. Everything is ephemeral, right? I don't know where that goes, but it's a thought that I was thinking about this morning that relates to this story. And so I took kind of an editor's cut of this antagonistic statement, this like little punk rock disruptor statement, and made it reflect this moment that we're in. And this moment that I think is actually, again, more optimistic, not one that should be built around fear of when's that 12-year-old kid going to completely destroy my industry and my business, right? Or hack into your system, because that'll happen, 100%, right? That's why you have jobs. And it was this, is that the reality is the rules have always been temporary. And if you go trace back into time, I guarantee you'll see that the rate of change of those rules has always gotten shorter over time. It used to take probably centuries for change to happen, and then decades, and then years. And now it's probably down to hours, I don't know, or minutes. It's crazy how ephemeral we are right now. But I think in that moment, in this statement, hopefully, going back to that statement of just try, there is more opportunity for us to actually put a new innocent idea out there and see where it can flourish to. How do we guide it to this thing that we might see that is foggy but gets clearer and clearer as we put the idea out there? So I hope in that last little statement we become a little less fearful of this moment that we're in and put our own personal creativity out there, either through professional means or personal means. Hopefully we have a little time for discussion, but with that, I want to thank you guys.
Any questions, intrigues, soft darts, hard darts? Go ahead.
So, I had a great presentation, and I had a very interesting learning from this. My daughter, who's 16, turning 17, so she said, Dad, I just want to take a break year or a gap year or whatever that they call. And, I just want to go to Korea and then spend a year, do stuff and skip school for a year and then come back and do college. I was like, hey, what's this stuff, So, because I'm planning for college and everything. And so sometimes, although I don't know if she's going to do it, but I'm beginning to, after your presentation, I'm beginning to think, maybe, let her take that risk. Right?
And how much risk is it?
It's not much,
right?
Actually.
Yeah.
Realistically speaking, it's not much. So that realization, although it's been running in my mind and as to how to convince her not to do stuff like that.
Yeah.
Then maybe this is, maybe she'll make a difference by doing that.
I think there's, so I went to college, but I dropped out, so I don't have a degree. Although oddly, I have an honorary one, so I don't know what that means. It's like a fake degree, but anyway, they're going to come and ask me for money at some point, which I don't have. Somebody had asked me a question or made some projection, which was, of course you're a college dropout like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm not those guys. That's iconic. That's insane. Those guys are insane. I don't think I'm insane. That's whole next level stuff. They also built their companies while they were in school, right? I was 35 when we started Kickstarter, right? So I was, old guy. And so I think there's this falsehood that we want to project into, say, that side of the world. I'd say that there's an equal falsehood that we want to project, that our parents, all of our parents probably want to project, and we as parents want to project. My daughter's 10, my son's 3, so I'm not yet in that zone, but maybe I'll get into that zone. And I think that is that, you go to college to learn how to work or to learn something that's going to get you a job. And if I can project anything about that last statement as well, is I went to school in the early 90s, right? And the moment I got into school, there was this thing called the internet, which was just, sort of a building block from bulletin boards. Anybody remember 2400 baud Hayes modems? Yep, dope. Also punk rock, or weird. And so, the world, as I was going through my learning in mechanical engineering, the world was starting to change, but ever so little, right? And I think it's just continuing to change. Like, I don't know, just to pick a job that didn't exist even when I got out of school, or even up until a couple of years ago, social media manager, or what's the other one? That's it, yeah, influencer. I was like, what? Like, what is that? Like, that's like, we could critique it, but that's also kind of amazing, right? And so I don't know what the right answer is. Like, that's for you and your daughter to work out over a lot of discussions, hopefully not the battle that my dad put me through. I will say this. I may not want to your daughter may not want me to share this. When I dropped out of college the first time, I actually dropped out twice. He said, "You're never going to go back." To which I should have said, "What does it matter?" Right? But I said, "I'm going to prove you wrong. I'll go back to Purdue in the middle of Indiana." Like, right? So I didn't go back there. I went to school in Chicago, where I was living at the time, but dropped out again. So I don't know what any of that means. But good luck with you and your daughter. That sounds awesome. I will say that Korea is amazing. Seoul is an incredible place to be. I don't know why she's going there, why she picked Seoul, but I would totally let her go. It's the BTS, which is like a whole nother acronym, which is not IBS. Who said IBS earlier? Like, what? Like, that's amazing. All right.
All right, go ahead. Yes.
So you mentioned about being gatekeepers, and yes, some of us are kind of gatekeepers in regards to controlling costs, but I used to work in venture capital, and many times you heard a pitch, and many times people were rejected.
Yep.
And so how much of the venture capital, basically community kind of influenced you guys doing Kickstarter so that people wouldn't have to go through that and have to have one person who's a partner say yes or no to their future?
Got to kiss a lot of frogs.
Right.
Yeah. So, oh man, that's a tough one, especially as like the whole venture world is changing dramatically right now. Term sheets are becoming more interesting. There's, I don't know, every 15 minutes there's a new app launched, and every day and a half a new venture fund started, right? I mean, it is ridiculous, which just means there's more frogs to kiss, right? I think ultimately, and I think this is as, we were fortunate to be a little bit older as entrepreneurs, and older. There's a fallacy that many entrepreneurs are in their teens or in their 20s, which is not true. But we were fortunate enough to be in our early to mid 30s and connected to some people that could at least project their experience on us and teach us before we went out there, right? Now, if you're starting a company, like there is so much information out there because for every 100 VCs, one of them's writing about the experience, right? So you get a better sense of who they are from a personality standpoint, what their worldview is. And so I think it's just like matchmaking, just like anything, right? Just like finding your first couple of employees, it's how much do you believe in that future that we're building towards? And then by virtue of that, how much do you, the future employee, believe in me, the founder or the entrepreneur, to guide us there, right? And I think the same goes for the venture world. Was there a specific thing around the gatekeeper thing, the no?
What happened was in the early 2000s, after the dot-com bubble burst,
Yep.
it was a lot more cautious.
We're in another one of those moments now, which is WeWork, but yeah.
Correct.
Yep.
So you could raise a $20 million fund with a PowerPoint.
Yeah.
In the late 90s.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, they claw that back because they're scared now. And so now you're getting evaluated at $1 million
Yep.
or two.
Yep.
So that being, from that point to when you guys started Kickstarter, it didn't seem like VCs were focused on a lot of these newer software type of startups, maybe more.
We were just coming out of that, right? 100%.
You guys come along and crowdsource now, and all of a sudden, I can get started here.
Yep.
Without having to answer to anybody.
So there's two parts in there that I think are interesting. One is like time is important, right? there's a lot of conjecture and projection around there being a downturn in the economy, right? Again, we just came out of one. Come on, right? So we're going to go through that again. And then now with this whole WeWork thing and the whole sort of tech IPO cycle, there's a little bit of conjecture around a correction in the market, right? Which probably ripe for, right? And I would say the era of the dot-com bubble in 99 to 01 basically was like totally ripe for a correction. It was getting insane. So I think those moments are always interesting because I think it's in those moments of silence that people are kind of huddled up again. They go back home to grandma and grandpa's house, or your daughter's gonna go to Korea, start a company, it's gonna fail, and she's gonna move back home, right? And that was San Francisco in 2001 and through 2003, right? 2005 is like, it became a ghost town for a minute. And people are not done, like they're just tail between their legs thinking, can we do this again? It's addictive, right? And so I think we'll probably see some downturn, some correction. I think we're at the the earliest of stages of seeing the potential for software and or hardware or whatever you want, the world writ large. I think we're at the very early stages of the change that we're talking about, right? And I think we reflect on, at some level, the easing from a very US-centric point of view, right? There's a whole globe of communities out there that like don't have iPhones and don't really know what Facebook is, right? Which is awesome. I was in Seattle yesterday, and my Lyft driver, I feel like I should say it that way. My Lyft driver is a hip-hop musician and producer, and he didn't even know what Kickstarter was. I was like, that's kind of dope. There's still more work to do, right? On the gatekeeper front, it's almost as though there always will be gatekeepers. I don't think gatekeepers are entirely bad, right? We all act as gatekeepers through Kickstarter. Yes or no? You're going to back the project or not? And I think maybe more so now than any moment in time. There are more people starting more venture firms right now, which just gives every one of us more opportunity to pitch more people. And so as much as there are more gatekeepers, that also gives a lot more variability in terms of who's going to equate to the idea that you're working on. So I have no idea if that even answered your question or.
It kind of paints what the landscape is today for a lot of these entrepreneurs that are trying to break through.
Yeah.
The different avenues.
And look, the pendulum is swinging. Both politically it swings and financially it swings, and like that's not bad, right? It is just what it is. So interesting reflection and question.
Any final questions? Yes, sir. Take one last.
Thanks for coming down to San Diego to be with us today.
Thanks for having me. I mean, the weather is like, I was walking in the sand yesterday. That was awesome, right? Can't do that in New York.
America's
Super
finest
gross.
city. That's the slogan.
Yeah.
So I'm on the board of an education foundation here in San Diego, and one of the things we did in the past year, I was doing a survey of different ed tech tools and things like that, and I started looking at like iPhone apps and stuff like this.
Yeah.
And as I was doing this survey, it occurred to me that I was observing this certain inefficiency that I had seen in other realms, like closer to my business where I work. But I looked at these apps, and there were some where it was like, X many dollars for this app, or this other ones it was like $10 a month subscription, and you get this tutoring service for your kid and stuff like this. And I'd be interested in your thoughts, because it started to occur to me that this drive for monetization had actually created its own inefficiency. That when I looked at all these different apps, if they had pooled their talent, it would have been amazing. But instead, there's like 100 of these different little apps that do this and that, and really cool stuff. But like, realistically, I'm not gonna subscribe to 10 of these things at $25 a month for my kid, or I don't know.
Yeah.
But so, I was just interested if this makes any sense and any thoughts you have on sort of this drive for monetization and how that may, in and of itself, create its own inefficiencies.
Interesting. We'll have to unpack that a little bit. Where I was hoping you were going to go was around the future of education, because I'm fascinated by that as a father of 2 kids and as a guy who dropped out of college with a wife who got her MBA, right? Like, she's overeducated, I'm undereducated, like, and none of it means anything, right? And so we didn't go there, right? But what we're talking about is kind of now, if I talked a little bit about the invisible race before, now what you're talking about is a visible race, right? I was on the phone a couple of weeks ago with an entrepreneur, I think he's based in New York, who's starting a Kickstarter-like platform for educational funding, right? So kind of in the space, at least, right? My daughter was in school last year, a different school. The school had us download a particular app called Seesaw, which is basically Instagram, but for teachers to talk about what's going on in school, which was super cool. She's in a different school now because she moved up a year in school, as it goes, and they don't use that app there, right? And so even within a school district, there's inefficiency because there's a plethora of entrepreneurs out there that are trying to reinvent what education means, and they see a market. There's a lot of ways that we can kind of unpack the monetization issue. I think there's 2 things in there, though. The bigger issue is just we're in a moment where anybody can have an idea and build something to project that idea. We have long been in that period, right? That is probably going to continue to happen as the cost of technology continues to drop, right? And so you're left with this like paradox of choice. I don't know so much that the monetization, like the immediacy towards monetization is such a negative, because you could argue Facebook, right? All of what's happened with Facebook is because they pushed off the monetization narrative, right, for a long time. So there's going to be a correction there at some point, right? So I don't know if that's necessarily what you were digging into. I'm actually very pro, as an entrepreneur, as a business builder, define some architecture for revenue early. It may be wrong, but at least do that. It's not just about eyeballs and clicks and likes and all those things. So I could never do a Twitter or Facebook. Like, that's just not in my DNA. And so I think I'd be on the side of all those tools out there. But I think the difficulty for sure is there's a plethora of them. And maybe that's the flip side to or the negative to decentralization, or the negative to too many gatekeepers allowing things to get through. I have no idea, right? At some point, there will be a consolidation, right?
I'll have to bring it to a close because we are getting close to the time, but yeah. So any final comments? You're good?
I'm good. Are you guys good? You're good? Yeah.
You're good.